Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Amside podcast, the show that talks about all things disc golf. From weekend rounds with your mates to the Pro Tour over in the States, we've got you covered all from an amateur perspective. My name's Rob and I'm here with my co-host Dale.
Hello.
Dale, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about what they can expect from this week's show?
Absolutely. So, after last week's surprise drop of episode 1, we are back with another episode. So, we've got no Pro Tour. That is the end of February. So, today we thought it'd be a great point to talk about used versus new. We've both got some great experiences for both. We've both got new and used discs in our bag. And we thought we'd discuss this and see how we can help amateurs get the best out of their starter sets and starter game.
Brilliant. Well, I look forward to jumping straight into that. But first, just a quick message from the sponsor of the show. The Amside podcast is sponsored by dischub.co.uk. So if you're looking at buying some new plastic and you want great prices, great customer service, and a fantastic range of brands, then look no further than Disc Hub. You can also get free shipping on orders over £30 and use our code AMSIDE5 for 5% off your next order. So, Dale, let's start with used, because I think that's probably the area that a lot of newer players and older players have a lot of experience within. So last week you mentioned that you had a starter set made for you when you started out, but you didn't specify if that was new or used discs. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about that?
No, brilliant. So, when I got my 10 disc starter set, they were all used discs. They were all discs that had been loved. They, in a sense, they were well seasoned discs. But I think that helped. These discs were a lot easier to throw than brand new plastic. They were a little bit more understable because they'd been beaten in, so they'd lost that stability. I think a great point we talked about last week is my buzz. My buzz has been in my bag since day one. I think you threw it when we played Root Revenge, didn't you?
Yeah.
And that for me is a very understable buzz. A buzz is a very straight flying disc, but I also bag another buzz that is brand new and that's got a different flight. But I think having that understable plastic to start with, having that understable beating disc certainly helped for beginners because I think they get a better flight out of it personally.
Yeah, I think, it's not any secret that if a disc flips up, it traditionally gets a little bit longer of a flight. So I think having some used discs in your bag that potentially give that to a newer player. I know we have friends that throw with DX discs because they're new to the sport, but actually DX breaks in a lot quicker. So actually they're able to get a little bit more distance from some of that plastic.
No, I agree, and I think having that understable plastic as a beginner, if you ask anyone's tips of for beginners, it's usually to buy understable plastic because that disc is going to flip up. It's not going to want to hit the ground as quickly. Whereas stable plastic, overstable plastic is going to usually stay on a hyzer most of the time for beginners and then and reach the floor because it wants to reach the floor as quick as it can. Whereas you're right, you've got that stability where it flips up and it's going to glide for longer. So I definitely think it is going to help a beginner get that flight. But also on the flip side, I don't know if you agree. I think that it made me feel maybe to start with I was a little bit better than I was.
Yeah, definitely. I think the first time you get a disc to flip up, it's definitely sort of a magical experience. You feel like you've done something special. So having something potentially more beaten in to begin with that allows that disc to flip, um, yeah, I think that's definitely a bonus to buying used discs to begin with. Um, Otherwise, you have to go for discs like the Leopard, which I know is a very popular beginner disc. But the reason it's popular is because it has that understability. So again, you get a similar feel of the disc flipping up and maybe going a little bit further.
No, I completely agree with that. I think the first time you ever get a disc to hyzer flip, it's a great feeling. We're going to talk about new discs, but just to brush over it, I think we was discussing before. I've got two destroyers in my bag. One's quite a flippy destroyer, and the other one's a lot more stable. One's been in my bag for a long time. It's beat in. I could get that on the backhand to flip up, but a brand new one I wouldn't be able to. So I think it can sometimes cause a false sense of security. If someone's got a beaten used destroyer and they think, right, I want to upgrade and get a brand new one, it could cause them to then think, wait a minute, why is this not doing the same as the old one? If they don't understand flight numbers and beating in disc properly.
I think that's absolutely nail on the head. That's the big consideration you need to have when buying used discs, which is if you buy a used disc, there's nothing to say that if you then buy a new version of that, it will fly anywhere near the same way. I have used discs and new discs, the same as you, of the same mold, and they couldn't be further apart in sort of their flight paths. So I think that's definitely maybe a downside to used, or at least a large consideration to make. Is you're buying used, they'll usually be slightly flippier, so you shouldn't take the way they fly as gospel.
No, completely agree. I think when when you buy in new used discs, you know, you've got to throw it yourself to really understand it, because I could sell a used Zeus, and then someone else could throw the exact same used Zeus when they receive it, and it flies completely different. So I think it's all to do with your own personal game.
Absolutely. So if there's anyone listening that might not know where to buy used discs, I don't know if you wanted to maybe recommend a few places in the UK. I know we're UK based, so that's where we buy ours. But where can our listeners go to buy used discs, Dale?
Yeah, so if you look for UK used disc sales on Facebook, it's a great site. I think it's nearly reaching 1,000 members. I think we've just hit over 700, and it's a great place where every day there's posts of people putting up discs they've got for sale. I've bought plenty of discs over there in the past, and I will continue to do so. Um, Obviously, you can go further afield. There's sites all across the world. Just learn that market. I've just recently tapped into the US market buying used discs because they've got a bit more variety. Just be prepared and do your research. But I think in the UK, yeah, UK use is no other place you can really get discs like that, is there?
No, not at all. I think the US, there's definitely a lot more options. I know we've mentioned Play It Again Sports that they have over in the US, which is a physical brick and mortar shop where you could go in and buy used discs. I know there's also been a couple of stories online of absolute treasures being found in those stores. Um, but yeah, the UK, I think there's definitely really one place and one place only, really. We do have sort of the beginnings of some amazing collector groups so on Facebook. So if you're looking for Discraft, Innova, or Trilogy specifically, there are pages specifically which also have people selling discs on. So it's just about really immersing yourself with those Facebook pages, and you're definitely going to find some interesting plastic.
No, agree. And just prepare yourself that when you do sign up to these sites, that you will become addicted and will spend a lot of money. But I think you made a good point about the collectors groups, because that's a great place to find used discs that are maybe a little bit more special. And you say about Play It Again Sport. If I could walk into a Play It Again Sport and find an OG Brody Smith Get Freaky for $9 and then sell it on his collector page for over 100, then I'd be quite happy. But that's a completely different story. I think a good point you made about the UK site is buying used discs from there is the scale we all use. Why don't you talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, so if you're buying used discs from the UK, and I know it's actually broader afield than just the UK, the Sleepy scale is something you'll hear a lot about, and that's essentially just the quality scale from 10 being essentially brand new, unthrown, untouched, even down to about a 3, which is it's about half the disc is missing. It's got dog tooth marks, and it barely resembles anything that we're used to. So I think it's a really useful tool. It's a really useful thing that we have in place and allows buyers and sellers to gauge the quality of a disc really well. Um, However, I think you really do need to understand that there is leeway, because obviously these are being sold not through a dealer or a collector, but they're being sold by individuals who are actually rating their own discs on this scale. So I know we both have stories where it's gone both ways, where we've bought a disc that's potentially an 8 or a 9 on the scale, and it potentially has been not as great as advertised. But also, I've bought discs that are a 6, 7, and actually, I think that they're almost new and used. So I think a pinch of salt is definitely something you need to take when you're using that rating system online.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's great we've got a scale that we can go by to see what sort of. But it's words. There's no scale out there that actually shows picture by picture. This is what this disc should look like. Because you're right, it is all down to buyer perception and seller perception. A seller may feel that their disc is a lot higher on that scale than someone else. Someone else might think actually this is a lot lower. I've seen really bad dye jobs that have been put on 8s out of 10s because the actual disc itself is a high enough standard. If it was brand new or without dye, you probably would be. But then you add the dye that have gone wrong, and it's still at that scale. And I think that's something that needs to be looked into as well.
Yeah, and I think sort of talking about customization, I think there's a really interesting point to make around inking discs as well. So we all know that people ink discs. I think we all agree that it's a sensible thing to do, so you get discs back. But I think where you ink your discs is really important because there's a lot of clear discs out there, and some people ink on the flight plate. Now, personally, if I'm looking at buying a used disc and it's inked on the flight plate rather than the edge of the rim, I personally think that actually knocks it down a rating because it massively affects the visuals of that disc. I know we want to throw discs and we want our discs to fly how we want them, and it's mainly performance. But at the end of the day, I want my plastic to look good.
Yeah, I agree. And I think at no way does inking on a flight plate going to change anything to do with that disc apart from aesthetics. But it is so important because some people on clear plastic, you don't want that person's phone number being there forever. If you put it on the flight plate, there's more chance it's going to get rubbed off. So I think it's a good point to make. Clear plastic, I would never ever um, ink on there. But I've got a question for you, Rob, if you're ready.
Yep.
Players' signatures. Where do you think that rates on the on sort of scale? So I've got a brand new disc. It's never been thrown, but I've got Paul Macbeth's signature on it. Does that downscale it, or does it stay the same?
Well, it depends on really the buyer, really. That becomes massively subjective. Say, for example, you had I mean, that's not so hypothetical. What is the disc that you have?
I managed to get my hands on a McBeast Buzz. I traded with one of my good friends, Zaki. He sorted me out of that. And at the rear of it, it's got Paul Macbeth's signature. Now, the disc's never been thrown, and I will never throw it. But does it then alter it because it's been signed?
So I think again, what I was going to say about being subjective, it's if I was a player looking for a buzz to throw, then arguably that's not a new disc anymore. I don't care about Paul Macbeth. I just want the buzz, etc., etc. So yeah, you could argue that it's actually being tampered with and it's not as valuable as a new disc. Obviously, that's a silly point to make because it's signed by arguably the greatest that's playing the sport currently. So does actually give a huge amount of value. Now, I think when you're talking about signatures, it's always subjective. So there isn't a right or wrong answer. For example, there's pros that I wouldn't necessarily care if they'd signed a disc. I won't give any names because, I mean, I think there's no room for hate in disc golf being such a great community. But yeah, I think I think it does increase the value, definitely. But there's arguments to be made on both sides.
Yeah, it's got to be for the right person, isn't it? That if that person's looking for Paul Macbeth's signature, it's going to mean more to them than if they just want a buzz to throw. I think we've both had good and bad stories when it comes to buying used discs. I know I've bought discs that have been said they're 9s out of 10s, and I haven't been told about ink on the rim. And then you get it, and you're like, oh, I wish I'd been told about that. It probably wouldn't have changed my decision to buy it, but it may have changed my decision to pay as much as I did for it, if you know what I mean.
No, absolutely, and I mean, and I've had the opposite. I've had discs that have been put up for great prices. They've maybe been down marked on the scale slightly, but I've been really, really happy. I think there's definitely a couple of people on the UK new and used site that are really hitting the nail on the head, and they're quite regular to buying and selling on the page. I know I bought my Mystere from Martin Colbert or Colbert. I apologize if I pronounced that wrong, but I know I think he normally hits the nail quite on the head when it comes to the discs that he's selling on there. And I know a few others that have got his X plastic, if you will. So I think I think there's no reason to not buy used. It's just there's a couple of things there that we mentioned that you might want to take into consideration. But I think now is probably a good period to go to new plastic. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think we started with starter sets in use, so why don't we do the same again? Because I think there are some great opportunities for brand new players to be able to throw brand new plastic without shelling out, big money for it. I think every disc golf manufacturer at the moment, or most of them, have got some incredible starter sets out there.
Absolutely, and then really the conversation just becomes what brand do you go for? But I agree 100%. I think if you ask anyone that's been playing disc golf for some period of time, um, all you really need is a driver, mid-range, and putter. I mean, that's not a rule that anyone sticks to because I have multiple putters, multiple mid-ranges, and multiple drivers. But at the base of it, you only really need 3 discs to play quite an extensive round. So I think, starter sets are a really great option if you're new to the sport and looking for something that's going to really allow you to jump out and play a full round. And also, there's not, you mentioned manufacturers producing starter sets, but also there's some great sort of independent companies making curated starter sets as well. So I think that's also a great option. I'm sure if you message anyone selling discs, especially the UK companies, they'll be more than happy to advise and put together a set for you that should work straight out of the bag.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point to make. I think starter sets eliminates that beginner buying the wrong disc because most starter sets are going to give you, an understable driver that isn't a 13 speed. It's usually between 8 and 9. You're going to get that mid range that's an easy to use mid range, and then a stable putter. Just off the top of my head, I know Discmania gives you, I believe it's a Link, an Origin, and then an Essence. Three of arguably one of their new evolution lines. They're excellent discs. I've thrown all 3 of them, and I've been impressed. But it stops that beginner having to think about, right, I have no idea what I'm doing here. I need some help.
No, absolutely. I think if I could rewind time and start again, I think I would definitely go down the starter set route. Maybe even go down. You can get the 3 disc starter sets, but like I said about curated starter sets, there's a couple of these brands selling larger sets, so 6 to 10 discs that can actually essentially fill your bag, especially for the first couple of months you're playing, and that's definitely a route that I probably would have gone down. But rather than that, I actually sort of went off some initial suggestions of discs. So I mentioned last week that I played my first round with a couple of discs that I found in a boggy lake. That didn't include a putter. I borrowed the putter from one of the president of the club that I went around with on my first round, and he kept recommending a T-Bird. Now, I didn't know anything about discs at that time. I had no idea what a T-Bird was. I assumed it was something from the film Grease. But I went home and I researched what this disc was that he mentioned, and I purchased it new, and it was a great suggestion. Now, the one thing I would say is that because I was new to the sport and I didn't want to spend too much money on cash on discs rather, which is laughable looking back on how much I have actually spent on discs since then. I decided to go for the baseline DX plastic option. Now, looking back at that decision, you could argue that that's a bad decision because it became understable very quickly. So I didn't really get a good amount of life out of that T-Bird as a T-Bird and performing as a T-Bird should. But on the flip side of that, what it did was it gave me a fantastic understanding of how a disc beats in, which I think, unless you have that experience firsthand, it's not necessarily something you would understand. So that T-Bird is now the flippiest thing in my disc, without question. In my bag, sorry, without question. So I think, yeah, buying new discs, especially for that experience to see how a disc breaks in over time, is really invaluable.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we both bought T-Birds at the same time, and we both bought T-Birds in different plastic. You know, you bought your Orange DX one, and I bought a Metal Flake Champion T-Bird. And I think yours beat in within, 3 or 4 rounds, whereas I've just sold my T-Bird, and I'd say it still flies quite similar to when I first got it. Would you agree?
Oh, massively. And I mean, you sold it to a player that we're friends with and we play rounds with, and he's getting use out of that disc as if it were a T-Bird still. It's still flying like that disc should. So I think, yeah, Metal Flake versus DX, there's worlds apart, those plastics.
And I think plastic's obviously a big thing as well. As a new player buying new discs, you know, are you going to understand the difference between plastic? You know, are you going to understand what Z Line is, what ESP is, what titanium is in Discraft or Champion or any other brand? Are you going to understand what every single one of their plastics is and how it's going to affect that flight number? I don't think so. And I think that's where new players need to be careful, because when you're buying new plastic, not knowing what to do, you're not going to understand what those flight numbers mean. And I know I certainly didn't when I started buying plastic.
No, absolutely. I think, again, throwback to last week's episode with you talking about your ballista that you purchased and me with that Westside Queen. I mean, huge speed discs, which I don't know anyone personally that can throw those numbers, or even if they could throw those numbers, chooses to, because they're such fast arm discs. So I think, yeah, there's definitely the beginner thinking that, okay, the faster the disc, the further it's going to go. But that is definitely a consideration that you need to take into, because it's not definitely not the case.
No, it's not. And I'm nearly a year into playing disc golf, and I removed everything from 11 speed down. And I've just, well, I got for Christmas a Nuke SS, and that's a 13 speed. And I'm only now feeling confident that I could buy that disc brand new and throw it properly. Whereas beforehand, I don't think I'd be able to get anywhere near the flight out of it.
Yeah, your Nuke SS is a really interesting case, really, and similar to in my bag, I have a Discmania DDX. Now, those discs are faster discs than both of us throw. I mean, we throw those two, but they're faster than the average disc that we throw. But there is also the argument to be made that not every disc is made equal, and actually some faster discs may have characteristics that make them easier for the slower arm player. So your Nuke SS, you can get a really nice flight out of that, a really nice flip line, similar with my DDX. So I think while this isn't an advert to new players saying, hey, you should go out and throw 12, 13 speed discs, I think it's definitely, again, to use the word subjective, which I think really is blankets the whole of disc golf, disc buying. I think it's definitely definitely to each player is their own, and they need to make these decisions based on one, their arm, and also if the plastic is actually true to form.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've got a Halo Destroyer, or a Halo Star Destroyer, 12.5 minus 1.3, so it's overstable. If I was to throw that on a backhand, it would hyzer and then dump, because I haven't got the power to be able to get that to fly. My Zeus is exactly the same numbers, but I could get a Zeus to flip up and go, purely because different manufacturers, flight numbers aren't always the be all and end all. It's all to do with personal preference, I think.
Absolutely, and that kind of brings us on to a really interesting point, which is trying new discs. So, Dale, you come from a ball golf background, and you played ball golf for a good majority of your life. And when buying golf clubs, then there is that element of you're able to try new putters, try new clubs before you buy within the store. And in the UK, especially, I know there's some shops in the US that allow you to try putters in store baskets, but in the UK, especially, there's not the ability, there's not the space to try discs before you buy, which obviously makes pulling the plug and actually making that decision a little bit harder because you're not necessarily sure if it's something that you'll 100% get on with.
Yeah, I agree. I think with ball golf, you go to that shop, you get custom fitted, and you've got that new iron set. Yet probably you're spending 10 times the amount. You're spending £500 on a set of irons as opposed to £20 on a disc. But it's just as important. You having the right irons is so much as important as having the right fairway driver. And I think a good point to make on that is that it makes it more difficult because you're buying blind. I watch a lot of YouTube videos but that's not going to tell me how I'm going to throw it. That's just showing how someone else has picked up the disc and is able to get a flight out of it. So it does make it more difficult.
Absolutely, I agree. So I think we've talked a lot about used, talked a lot about new, um, and this definitely isn't something that we're going to be able to give a definitive answer to um, anytime soon because, again, to use the word subjective, that's exactly what it is, and each player is going to be different. But I think, so Dale, after what we've talked about, new versus used, you right now, as your bag sits, what are you looking at?
Okay, so I think I'm in a place now with nearly being a year down the line with disc golf that I understand my form and how I throw a disc well enough to be able to buy brand new discs. And most of the time, I will buy brand new discs on that reason because I want something that's going to look nice in my bag for the first time I've got it, but also something that I can personally beat in. I can throw into that trees. I can do what I want to do to it to beat in. So my answer would be no, personally.
Awesome. Well, I think my personal opinion isn't quite as black and white, but it's fairly similar. So if I'm looking at buying a specific disc, say if tomorrow I went out and I threw my T-bird in the water, I was looking for a specific replacement to that disc, I would probably go new, just because I know, again, the behavior even from new to beaten in, how that disc is going to fly. Um, and so I wouldn't necessarily window shop on new disc sites, but I would go there for specific purchases, and that's for certain. I wouldn't necessarily wait for one to come up on a used site. But I think both of us are in the same position. We're always on these used sites just to see if there's any gems that are popping up, and every now and then we get something special.
No, definitely. I completely agree. I think that's a great place to finish. I think we've made some great points, and hopefully, it's going to help that amateur disc golfer make that decision a little bit easier. They might be able to do a bit more research into flight numbers and have a bit more understanding than when we first started.
Absolutely. And if you are looking to buy new after what we've discussed, remember that you can't go wrong with dischub.co.uk. They're the sponsor of the show. And Dale, where could they go to potentially get an extra 5% off the order?
Yep, if they just put in their cart, if they put AMSide 5 for 5% off their next order.
Awesome. And don't forget you get free shipping over £30 as well. So you really can't go wrong.
No, and I think that's a great place to finish, Rob. I've had another great episode. I can't wait for episode 3 already. But I just want to thank the listeners for listening. Make sure you go check us out on our Instagram and Facebook at the Amside Podcast. This will be coming to all your major platforms, your Apple, your Spotify, anything you can think of. If we're not on something, give us a message and we'll make sure we get on there.
Fantastic. Until next time, if we don't see you on the course, we'll see you on the Amside.